My name is Grace Namugambe from FEMNET, and I will be the moderator for this session. And just to introduce the session, we recognize that across the African continent and within the global Africa diaspora, the demand for reparations has emerged as one of the most defining calls for justice in the 21st century. This demand is not new, and it is deeply rooted in centuries of resistance to slavery, colonization, apartheid, and the racialized and gendered hierarchies that continue to shape global power structures. Today, as we grapple with injustices such as the escalating debt crisis and the deepening climate emergency, we must recognize these crises as aftershocks of colonial systems that were never dismantled. This moment calls on us to pause, reflect, and collectively chart a path forward towards debt and climate justice through the lens of reparations. In this session, we will critically examine the interlinked crises of debt and climate through decolonial, feminist, and human rights perspectives. And guided by two key publications, one which is titled The 10 Decolonial Feminist Principles to Unlock Climate Finance in Africa, and the second one, Pan-African Feminist Perspectives on Justice Through Reparations, we will unpack the colonial and gendered roots of Africa's debt burden, exploring how unjust debt regimes imposed on climate vulnerable African countries fuel ecological destruction, widen inequalities, and undermine human rights, while also disproportionately impacting African women, girls, and other marginalized communities. And to lead us through this discussion today, I have 4 distinguished panelists. The first is Afrika Kiza, who is a political economist with over 13 years in trade and development policy across the African continent and currently serves as an economic justice advisor at Christian Aid. The second panelist is Miss Penny Mbabazi, whose most recent work is aimed at advancing linkages between climate justice, human rights, and economic policies, and is the climate justice lead at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. My third panelist is Tusaiwe Sikwese, who is a public policy analyst and a development enthusiast, and is currently working with Action Aid Malawi as a policy coordinator for economic justice and rights. And the fourth panelist is Miss Patricia Morozi, who is an African feminist lawyer and advocate who currently serves as an economic justice and climate action activist at Akina Mama, Afrika. So to quickly start the discussion, I'd like to hand over to Afrika Kiza, who's going to give us the political economy analysis, sharing an overview of the current debt and climate crisis and how we got here.
Thank you, moderator. It's interesting. A colleague said, you are the only man in an all, in a largely female panel. I said, no, I'm the only feminist in an all feminist. Oh, yes, because my name Afrika is feminine, actually. I'm the only person who has an affidavit that swears that my name is mine, you know, as a male. So I will try to weave the historical aspects and the global power symmetries regarding climate and debt aspects. And let's first look at the Industrial Revolution. Way back from the 18th to the 19th century, where we saw 500 years of slave trade, 100 years of colonialism. What was the footprint? The carbon footprint, but also the debt footprint from the aspect of reconfiguration of Africa's, not even Africa actually, the global south economic trajectory. So we saw during the Industrial Revolution increased use and banning of dirty energy, coal, oil, and you find that the United States and Europe alone were responsible for 50% of historical cumulative collective emissions. I remember even in the UK they had what they called the Great Stink, when the River Thames was rendered biologically dead. I don't know how a stink can become great, but that is how the situation was. And in terms of, so we already have that colonial accumulated carbon emissions through industrial revolution. They're now industrialized countries. I am being careful not to use the word developed countries. There's nothing developmental when you are the most destructive species or country in the world or race in the world. There's nothing developmental when you are strategically and systemically coercing and perpetuating injustices that lock other countries into a beggar and dependent situation where they cannot be able to take themselves up. So I'm using the word industrialized. Now, the colonialism aspect in terms of the losses from the debt perspective now. So we already have a carbon footprint, a climate injustice at the onset in the Industrial Revolution. When it comes to losses, extraction, for those that are looking at debt, let me give you just a few figures. During colonialism, that is 100 years. No. Slave trade, 500 years. 97 trillion of today's value in slave trade was extracted from Africa. In terms of colonialism, we saw there's a study by Hicks. He says Britain alone extracted 45 trillion US dollars just from India. We cannot even talk about Africa. It is even increasing. So that was the aspect. And this extractivism has continued in today's illicit financial frauds. TGNA and other allies Stop the Bleeding, Akina Mama Afrika, FEMNET put it at 8.6 billion US dollars annually. So we have seen a systemic extraction, both in terms of IFFs, but also in terms of locking in climate injustices between the global south and the global north. I think I have 2 minutes left. The colonial debt trap is another aspect, what we are still struggling with historically to date. When you look at the colonial debt trap, when we are granted, again I'm being careful here with words, flag independence, we don't even have political independence. Our multi-party system was dictated by the so-called mother countries or the metropole. So when we got flag independence, the colonial, again, not masters, the colonial, whatever you want to call them, left us with a colonial debt. In terms of DRC was left with, in today's present value, 5 billion US dollars, a colonial debt that it had to pay. When it came to Kenya, 2.8 billion US dollars. And what is interesting, this is where the feminist aspect comes in, especially the burden on women. Why do we see women, for example, in Kenya, not having access to land? The British settlers were left with 7% of the arable land in Kenya, 7 million acres. Now, what is even exciting is that to date, Kenya is still paying actually reparations, Kenya is still paying British pensioners, 1,500 British pensioners living in Britain, an amount equaling to 24 million Kenya shillings per year. This is like 186,000 US dollars. You might say, no, that's pocket change. But actually, when you can't fight on African parameters, this amount is able to build 30 classrooms and just one fully functional maternity ward. So that's the extractivism. 1 minute to go. Who owes who? And how do we then construct the aspect of injustices to be able to move on, as a single front in Africa? We have seen tokenism and box shifting when it comes to the climate change discussions. We had a stalemate at the Kyoto Protocol where the highest polluters were supposed take on more commitments. That was rejected. Canada pulled out, United States pulled out. These are the biggest polluters. Then we said, okay, since we do not want to take on more commitments to reduce on emissions, let us go with nationally determined contributions. You are asking the United States to determine nationally its own climate carbon. That is tokenism. So we keep seeing, and even with those NDCs, Trump has said, no, we are ban, baby, ban, drill oil, drill, baby, drill. So we are still seeing this injustice constructed in colonial connotations. Lastly, let me talk about the issue of land grabs. And maybe if I talk about land grabs, the fact that we are again seeing tinkering of boxes, that governments have now said, no, we do not want to finance our own climate. Let us bring in the private sector to do the financing. That's what we saw in FFD4, Seville. That's what we are still seeing, the narrative that is being parroted by countries. Let us bring private finance. But we know private finance is locked into the same masculinity, into the same patriarchal systems that are destructive and that are largely locking out women and youth from development. So lastly, the question of land grabs. We cannot talk about the history of development, the history of industrialization, the history of climate change without looking at land grabs. I have had under AFCOD and amongst our fraternities, we are talking about carbon dates, green carbon financing. We are talking about the green deals. And this is what is happening. We are actually seeing the mortgaging of land for the benefit of the countries that are already the biggest polluters. The United Arab Emirates, which has created amassed wealth through destruction and utilization of a dirty energy source, that is oil, has been one of the biggest buyers of carbon credits in Africa. Take an example. When you look at Liberia, 10% of Liberia's land has been given to United Arab Emirates as part of the carbon credits. In terms of Zimbabwe, my friends from Zimbabwe, 20% of Zimbabwe's land, Arab land, has been now left just as part of the carbon sinks. So we are seeing that extractivism again happening in the discussions about through green deals, green energy transition, and all that. So in conclusion, we need to look at how do we bring in the question of historical injustices into the current context and how they continue to manifest and metamorphose. When we talk about climate justice, date justice, without feminist justice, we risk reproducing the same systems of exploitation because it is women who carry the heaviest weight of these intersecting crises and yet receive the least support. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Afrika, for painting that picture. I'd like now to pass it on to Penny, who will take us through the human rights approach and basically speaking to how this crisis has continued to undermine the achievement of human rights.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Afrika, for creating the scene clearly. From a human rights perspective, of course, there are a number of different laws and obligations that we have seen continuously emphasized in this discussion around the climate crisis, but also in regards to how much is being lost as African countries, as developing countries, given that we're paying so much in interest rates, but also in who bears the brunt of this climate crisis issue. And looking at the women, but also looking at the structural inequalities that climate crisis does cause, it creates a reason as to why we need a human rights-based approach and a human rights-based lens for us to look at things also from that human rights perspective. even for the UN Basic Principles on Right to Remedy and Reparation, they clearly outline that what justice must look like for communities experiencing climate-related harm. And indeed, climate change does undermine the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, development, but also a sustainable environment. And it's only here that we get to see that there have been a number of principles that have been put in place. There's a polluter pays principle. There is the common but differentiated responsibility that we see that even when these were embedded in law or even in writing, they are not fully being complied to. And you find a number of, right now what we're seeing is that all these extractive economies trying to put the responsibility on developing countries, trying to shift the blame actually to developing countries. And it's not even better when they have a number of different false solutions, as we call it, that are being proposed. The private sector and coming into the discussion around climate. How really can we quantify putting the lives, profit before the lives of people? How do we actually see the systematic loss and damage? How can we actually quantify that will be compensated to communities on ground that have lost their land but have also lost their well-being? So there's a need to see that we do have a number of different laws that should be shaped. I can give an example of the human rights treaties, the International Covenant of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, that shares that requires states to mobilize and maximum available resources to realize the rights, including through fair taxation, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and regulating financial flows. And we know how much fossil subsidies were lost, just 7 trillion last year. Those fossil subsidies cannot and will not be quantified to the loss of loss and damage that has been created on ground for communities. And still, we see that there is even a requirement for states to prevent retrogression, meaning governments cannot use debt or crisis as an excuse to cut back on right protections. And also corporate internationally by providing climate finance, sharing technology, and removing barriers to adaptation and development in the global south, but also respecting extraterritorial obligations, ensuring that their own actions, or those of corporations and banks under their jurisdictions, do not cause harm. So there's definitely an intersection to the two, debt crisis and the climate crisis, the climate injustice. But there's need for us to also see how best can we actually now use the current discussions happening with our advisory opinions. When we look at how, guaranteeing transparency and participation and accountability, especially in decisions about how funds raised and allocated and governed. These climate advisory opinions recently, especially for the ICJ and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, have tried to bring a lot of clarity and coherence of states' obligations around climate change. But we still see that there is a need for human rights and climate finance to be legally intertwined and not optional, that it is not merely charity, that when we're looking at climate finance is that we actually do need those extractive and developed countries to actually pay their share, but also to see that states must also be able to mobilize accessible, sufficient, and equitable finance as a legal obligation. We cannot require countries that are facing so much of this debt to still go ahead and mobilize their own resources. There will be no funds. There's no way to say that you can actually go and find ways of calling for climate reparations and still finding that it's a challenge to even enforce it, because the laws that are there have not actually been in favor of developing nations. So issues to do with how we need to enforce restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction are very key. And these advisory opinions are trying to change the trajectory to say that enough is enough. There's a need for a human rights perspective and approach in dealing with climate and debt issues, but still also climate justice itself is one that cannot do without dead justice or feminist justice. So it's high time that some of these discussions do come out clearly. So I'm happy to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny, for that, and for clearly showing why we need to have the human rights perspective therein. I'll now quickly pass it on to Saiwe to share with us some of the grounded realities from where she sits, looking at some of the lived experiences of women and communities in navigating the debt burdens and the climate justice, and how the intersection between these two has continued to exacerbate gender inequality and social exclusion.
All right, thank you so much. And the first two speakers have said quite a lot, and the second one has said, it felt like she was making my presentation. But I will share lived experiences from Malawi, and I know that there are a few of my fellow Malawians in here. If I'm lying, please call me out. Yeah, so obviously we all know that Africa, and as a whole, we are in a debt. A lot of the countries are in a debt crisis, and for Malawi, we were declared we were declared in debt distress in 2023, and in that same year, right after the IMF and World Bank annual meetings, we were given an extended credit facility, which we forfeited this year, actually, because we were not able to meet what the IMF and the World Bank were looking for in the less than 2 years that we got the extended credit facilities. The reason why I'm giving this background is so that you have an understanding of where partly of where all of this is coming from, because obviously it starts from far back as the 1980s, which I will not get into. So when it comes to the debt distress that I'm talking about, these obviously, like I said, the IMF and the World Bank impose conditionalities that affect women and girls the most. How do they affect the women and girls the most? There's poor quality of access and poor quality and low access to key public services, and not just key public services, but gender-responsive public services, because obviously women, girls, men, and boys are different, and we have different requirements when we're accessing these public services. And so because then we have this debt that we have accumulated over the years, we are unable to make the repayments. Yes, we were forgiven, the debt was forgiven, I'm not sure how long ago, probably when I was not really able to understand these things, but we got more loans, more extended credit facilities, and we are still, that's why we ended up where we are now. And because of that, Malawi has to pay back interest, higher rates of interest, right? So we're at 27% at the moment, if not 30%, that we're paying towards the debt that we have, which obviously is a problem, because we have commitments that we made, for example, the Abuja Declaration, which is 50% towards health. And currently, Malawi only budgets 12.2%. That is allotted to the health. This is in the 2024-2025 fiscal year. And on education, we committed to the UNESCO and Dakar commitment, which requires 20% of the fiscal budget to the education sector. But right now, it's only 15%. That's obviously not enough for the two services to be provided in good quality and with the right human capital. So this, again, it took us down to women who bear the burden of taking on multiple roles. I'll start with education, with the health. So with this, because they're not able to provide medications in the hospitals, and some of the communities, the rural communities especially, the health centers, do not have staff because the wage bill cuts, And these people are not motivated enough to go to work. And when you see the communities themselves, they're not something, if let's say I am a nurse and I did my education in town and now you're sending me to a very remote area, there's no electricity, there's no water, I'm not going to want to go there. And so now these women have to find a way to get to hospitals, health centers close by. That's a cost. Where they're going to get this money when they're not able to participate economic activities, right? They can't make this money. Again, they have responsibilities at home to take care of their families. So you can already see that there's this huge burden. They cannot participate in economic activities. They cannot participate in political, spaces. Why? They're busy at home trying to find food. They're busy at home trying to get water. They're busy at home trying to take care of their, the sick, whether it's the husband or the children. They're basically doing all the unpaid care work. They don't have the time to go to these places. I'm going to just connect that to now the cyclone Freddy, connecting it to the climate crisis, right? We all know again that the global south has very little to do with the climate crisis that we're in, but we're the ones who are affected the most, greatly affected. So we're experiencing several cyclones, several climate issues, and the most recent one that Malawi experienced was that was what, 2023 was it? Yes, 2023, Cyclone Freddy. I went to one of the affected districts, it's called Nsanje, to have conversations with the women and girls in the camps. And it was a very sad situation, just learning about their stories. And although I didn't hear this particular one from the woman who experienced it, but she was pregnant and almost due, right? And the health center there and the hospitals, the health center there where she was, washed away. Washed away. Now this person is due. There's no ambulances. What does she do? She gets on a bicycle to get to the nearest health center. The roads are in a terrible condition. Again, why? Because a lot of the money is going towards debt repayment. Climate financing, we're trying to repair the loss and damage that's been caused by all of this. So it's really not also going towards the right things. It's not going towards the public services. It's not going towards gender-responsive public services, which is something that as Action Aid we are advocating for. Gender-responsive public services budgeting, because we understand the burden that women have to go through because of these cuts that the government makes. And again, I mentioned that the health workers don't get enough pay. So in our most recent research titled The Human Cost of Public Sector Cuts, which I urge you to have a read, 100% of health workers were found to face inadequate pay. 72% experienced a 30% income drop since 2020. Already these are affecting the communities, right? And then beyond that, beyond the pay, there's 100% report severe stress and mental health crisis. And if you're not in the right mental state, you're not going to be able to provide services as you should. And again, women and girls are at the receiving end of this, right? Moving on to education. Education-wise, in the early 90s, when the multi-party system started in Malawi, primary education was now considered free. It's still free today, but it's terrible. It's very terrible because, again, I just don't, move around in these spaces, but I go to the ground to see what's happening and, and so sometime last year we were donating desks to a primary school, and the people here were very excited that this was the first time they were getting desks. And it's 2024. It's not funny, but it's kind of funny. It's 2024, and they're still sitting on the floor. Not only that, but they still learn under the tree. Again, everyone, it's 2024. We shouldn't be experiencing these things, right? But it goes back to the debt burden. So we have students struggling with basic literacy, poor learning outcomes, and families burdened by rising education costs. Because even though it's free, they now still have to pay for school uniforms. They still have to pay towards this, make a small contribution towards the children's education. But again, where is this money going to come from? There's really not, even the informal sector itself is terrible. And even the paid care work, let's say you're a domestic worker, some of them still get paid below the minimum wage in the country. Again, it's not working for women, it's not working for girls, and girls end up getting married early because why? They're trying to support their families, right? So it's all of these things, and then you still find that with the climate crisis, again, the school structures destroyed, teachers not interested in going back. The pay is poor. Teachers are struggling to afford their children's education themselves. So 90% of the teachers struggling to afford their children's education, and then there's a 50% real income drop for teachers from starting in 2020. So when you add all that to the climate injustices that are happening, you can already see that, like she said, you can't separate the two. The two cannot be separated. That's the situation that we're in. We need to obviously come up with very plausible and practical solutions for us to tackle these issues and support women, because women, again, comprise 60 to 80% of the agricultural labor force in Malawi, putting them at the center of finding food for their families. So if there's the flooding, what happens then? There's no food on the table. What happens to the children? They won't be able to eat. They're not going to go to school, and they'll end up, again, it's either sex work, or they're getting married early, or engaging in self-destructive things just so they can find something to eat. So Malawi is struggling with adaptation, I'm sure, like most countries are. And this is obviously also consistently being fueled by the external debt that we're in, that we're failing to repay. And as we speak right now, the economic situation in Malawi is terrible. We do not have Forex. So yes, we do not have Forex. And yeah, that's where I will stop for now, and I will give my final views and experiences at the end. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll quickly move to Patricia. With all that we've had from Afrika, Penny, and Tisaiwe, how can we move forward to achieve debt and climate justice through reparations while using a Pan-African feminist approach?
Thank you, Grace, and all the speakers. So, like has already been discussed by everyone on the panel, is that the question of reparations must be central to any discussion on debt and climate justice. And I think we also discussed that at length yesterday, that reparations must be understood not only as an acknowledgement of responsibility or apologies and financial redress and restitution for the injustices of slavery and colonialism, but that it is a political project of repair to challenge and repair the systems that continue to produce these harms and the current global crisis they have created, which is one of the principles that's highlighted in one of my favorite papers on reparations, which is reparations as a pathway to decolonization. So this means we need to dismantle the systems that continue to reproduce these inequalities and exploitation and ecological harm, which are systems also of heteropatriarchal capitalism, as Sylvia Tamale so promptly put it. So I'm just going to also bounce off one of the papers that has been cited by Tisaiwe, which is the Action Aid 2023 report, which talked about rich polluting countries and how they are liable for about $107 trillion to climate vulnerable low and lower income countries. And this figure obviously is so much
Patricia?
bigger. Oh,
Can you just slow down a bit for
I'm so sorry. Yes, okay. So I was talking about the debt that's owed by the rich polluting countries, which is about 107 trillion US dollars, in comparison to the 1.5 trillion that's owed, the external debt that's owed collectively by climate vulnerable countries. And we also know that this ecological debt is also growing day by day. And this same report also highlighted how under the Paris Agreements, global north countries had pledged 100 billion US dollars in climate finance, but 2/3 of that came in the form of loans, which obviously deepened an already ongoing debt crisis for global south countries, including Africa. So rather than repairing the ongoing planetary harm, they were actually worsening this crisis. And again, last year at COP29, I know we've already talked about the figure, which was 107 trillion that's owed in ecological debt in terms of, financial and fiscal debt. But also, the only amount that they agreed to pledge was 300 billion at COP29. And again, they refused to commit that this should come in the form of grants and not loans. And this principle that climate finance must be debt-free is supposed to recognize that the global south is already burdened with significant debt, with reports claiming that Africa alone carries a debt burden of 1.8 trillion US dollars. So in this context, we see that climate finance in the form of loans and debt instruments such as bonds, debt for nature swaps only serves to exacerbate the current debt crisis faced by many countries. And also, like the previous speaker mentioned, it limits the ability to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation, but also in overall economic stability and development. So we see debt itself being a driver, but also a consequence of the climate crisis. Also to talk about how this debt also locks countries like ours into extractive economic models which are geared towards debt repayment in foreign currencies, which further damages our ecosystems and worsens vulnerability. So we know that the IMF and the World Bank, which were institutions of the colonial era but still exist up to today and are dominated by wealthy states and prioritize, obviously, debt payment over provision of social services that our governments should be doing. And this results in austerity, reduced access to essential services, and intensified unpaid care work, which, as was mentioned previously, disproportionately burdens women and girls. So reparative justice demands not only debt cancellation, but also a fundamental overhaul of the current global financial architecture, such that power is shifted away from these colonial institutions, which is also part of the vision of the UN Tax Convention on international tax cooperation. This is what it's trying to do, which is where we need more of our African countries participating in these negotiations. So reparations, again, must be broad and systemic. As I said previously, it must include immediate debt cancellation, redistribution of wealth through fair taxation, and also here we can talk about wealth taxation. We must reject exploitative and profit-driven schemes that financialize the climate crisis. I think Afrika and also Penny talked about these instruments such as the debt for nature swaps and the carbon markets, and how they just are a continuation of these neo-colonial logics which shift responsibility from the polluters to those who are least responsible for this crisis. So I just want to quote something that was said by indigenous leaders who protested at COP26, that carbon markets represent an illusion constructed to salvage capitalist economies rooted in resource extraction and colonialism, because they continue to allow rich countries to dodge their obligations while commodifying people and ecosystems in the global south. And you can find an even stronger critique of carbon markets and all these other financial instruments in the report by Power Shift Africa and others in 2023. So a Pan-African feminist approach calls for rejecting such false solutions and centering strategies that build sovereignty, justice, and sustainability. And a gender transformative climate system is one that is a crucial component of the proposed feminist climate finance architecture. It recognizes and values the vital contributions of women, indigenous people, and global south communities in protecting, preserving and sustaining the global ecosystem and biodiversity. These contributions, of course, are usually overlooked and undervalued in the current climate finance architecture because, again, we know whose knowledge is prioritized. It's always Western knowledge and never our own, but we know how to take care of our own land and our planet. So it's important that this knowledge is also centered in discussions about climate justice and a just climate transition. I would also want to speak about the degrowth movement, and here I will talk about the work of some Pan-African feminists such as Zo Randriamaro and Benji Akbulut. I hope I haven't butchered their names too much, but degrowth calls for a downscaling of energy and resource use in the global north, whose pursuit of endless economic growth is built on appropriation of cheap labor and resources from the global south. So apart from calling for things like such as debt cancellation, we're also saying that there should be degrowth. This obsession with economic growth as it is currently defined is actually what's killing the planet, and it's actually what's exploiting people even further because as I think Afrika talked about, we know whose labor and whose resources are being extracted in order to develop, or I know you said not developed countries, but they are trying to develop themselves on the backs of black and brown people. So ultimately, reparations must be understood as a structural, systemic, and emancipatory. They must dismantle unfair trade agreements, cancel illegitimate debts, redistribute wealth, and transform the international governance systems. They must also restore sovereignty and agency to African nations and communities, enabling them to reclaim their futures. That's it for now. Thank you, Grace, and everyone.
Thank you for that, Patricia. I'd now like to open it up for... Okay. I'd now like to open it up for any comments or questions. Hey, okay. Okay, so I'll start from the front and keep going. Okay, I'll start from here and keep going.
Thank you very much to the panelists for those contributions. And kudos to you, to the Feminist Africa, for really breaking it down, what the debt quantifies to, the 30 classrooms and the one fully serviced maternity ward, because I think we need to appreciate that not everyone is an economist, so some of those figures, they don't necessarily make sense, and especially for civil society, they need to be, as they go back and engage with their communities, they need to understand what is at stake, and as well as to get the buy-in, not just from civil society, but for the parliamentarians as well, so that they understand what this means for their people. And then I also appreciate the elements that you also mentioned, Patricia, on the NDCs and green guarantees and all of those 4 solutions that now are within the global financial architecture and are being sold as the solutions that we need as Africans. But it's still perpetuates the same colonial capitalism model. So I just want to know that, in as much as we were talking about these, do the people that do the parliamentarians, the civil society understand what is at stake? Because we are having these conversations, right? And we're terming these as 4 solutions, but then we're not offering alternatives. And looking at the current economic landscape, our countries are really desperate for the money. And it's very difficult to reason with a hungry person and say, let's go to class when they need to be fending for themselves. So I think these are some of the elements that we need to go deeper into when we're talking about these 4 solutions, offer the alternatives. And one of the other things is that there's the, just energy transition and pathways. And what I'm seeing is it's more or less the same industrialization, because it's we're not empowering our communities to take part of these initiatives, and I'll give an example of maybe renewable energy projects. We could find ways on how we can empower women, young girls to benefit from, some countries have like feed-in tariff schemes, right? And that way they can earn an income as well as contribute effectively to the development of these projects. And I wonder to what extent this is a way, like a legal aspect in transforming our capital accounting frameworks that don't value social wealth. And like, we really need to break it down deeper. And then I think I'll stop there, and in transforming these special economic zones and stimulus packages to benefit the communities, because we can't be dictating to the global north and say we want grants, but we're failing to provide such models and frameworks for our people. So at least if you can try and start from and provide those case studies, and then when we're advocating, then it's like it's working already. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator and our esteemed panelists, for the exciting revelations that should guide us, going forward. My name is Pepukai Mujazondida Shinrai. I'm from Zimbabwe, Christian Aid. My name in the native language, it means open your eyes. So probably I'm at the right place at the right time. So I think this discussion from yesterday is speaking more to problem identification, problem analysis. And the fear really is we continue to remain there as Africa. And we have been discussing these things for quite a very long time. So the risk is fatigue. The risk is wear and tear, as we are all going somewhere and leaving this, revolution to the next generation. According to Kate Lewin, force field analysis, he emphasized more on identifying the driving and restraining forces to any problem, to any potential solution. So I think that's what we are lacking as Africa, to say what are our driving forces to address these long economic and historic challenges that we continue to see at a community, at a country and Africa level. And what are the driving forces that we need to take care of, and restraining forces that we also need to take care of? So as we tackle these historic injustices, we really need to say what are our building blocks, what are our founding principles to turn around, on this challenge. So I think that's where we are lacking. We have AU, we have other, regional and African blocks, but they are not doing close to probably 30 to 50% of their level of effort in addressing these challenges. What is it that we need to do? So I think we need to be getting solid updates in these engagements in terms of status and in terms of the gaps that they still see as limiting to address these issues. So I am not really seeing realization at AU level, realization at ECOWAS, realization at African, continental free trade area in terms of progress and the gaps. So we need to be identifying those gaps that are still limiting, because it seems like there is consensus to say we have a problem, but we don't have clarity in terms of where we are as a region, because this problem goes beyond individual countries' capacity. We need to take advantage of our numbers as 55 countries to address these challenges as a unified front. So I have some questions. For example, how can we protect our individual countries and communities to shield them from ongoing and persistent resource extraction by countries in the global north? Because it's still existing and it's continuing at our individual country level, at Africa level. Second, what systematic changes are needed, within the African Union to effectively address the historical and ongoing changes posed by colonial legacy? We need a systematic change because we are addressing a system which is very structured and powerful. Are we powerful enough to address? And if we are not, what is it that's needed so that we have the right frame to address this issue as a collective? Then lastly, we have countries that have already offsetted their debt. How are we treating these countries so that we also have their buy-in? Because at times they may say, we have solved our problems. And this may be left to those 22 countries that are still in debt crisis. What remains of the other, the difference from the 55? Because probably these are some of the gatekeepers that limits our collective advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you. You can pass it to Siviwe. So for purposes of time, please let's limit our questions and comments to 2 minutes so that we can hear from as many people in the room.
Yes, I will be brief. I have a question, actually. Firstly, thank you to all of the panelists. I think I in some ways disagree with the previous speaker in that I don't think that this conversation is just a repetition of an identification of the problem. I think it's very important for us to be conceptualizing these issues through a feminist lens, and I think that hasn't been done enough. And that is the thing that will help us to actually understand the problems better from an African perspective. So thank you all for your contributions. But in light of this question of, what is there to be done, the question for me, I think it was Afrika who mentioned the issue of nationally determined contributions. It's also been mentioned that there have been pledges that have been made, but the money is not coming through. There's the issue of that it's more debt instead of grants. What opportunities and challenges do you see, I think, in terms of advocacy, both within the kind of international space, but also domestically? I know that Tuseiwe mentioned some kind of resistance and issues that people are trying to take up from the ground, some challenges locally, and also in light of the UN system that we also clearly are seeing being exposed currently in terms of the limitations even with that system. Is that still the space that we believe this advocacy should take place? But also, what do we do with our national governments who, while people are resisting and protesting and for the right to say no, they're also challenging this. So it's not just international companies and countries dictating what's happening, it's also our governments who are letting them, who are also fighting against our communities and our people who are saying, we do not want this type of extractivism happening. So yeah, what opportunities and challenges do you see, and do we still participate in the fallacy of the UN system? Apologies.
All right, thank you. My name is Elvis. I work for Somali Climate Action Platform based in Mogadishu, Somalia. And I think my interest would go to the issue of loss and damage. And I know the colleague from Malawi mentioned something around that. And referring to a conference which happened in Malawi in March this year. It was the African Regional Conference on Loss and Damage. And one of the main challenges that came out was that many countries cannot still quantify properly the amount of loss and damage that is caused by climate change. And that also then means we will be limiting ourselves in terms of what are we asking for in terms of reparations. Because again, climate change, when you look at it in terms of what Africa is contributing, it's far much less, and the impacts are felt more. And you know, even in Malawi, it's one of the countries that has been affected a lot by the loss and damage caused by climate change. Same to Somalia and many other countries. So as institutions, I would be interested to know what we are doing in terms of actually ensuring that countries can be able to quantify the amount of loss and damage, so that when we are asking for reparations, we are asking for exact figures, which will then ensure that everyone and every loss and damage is taken care of in the process. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. My name is Gracia. I'm from Zimbabwe Coalition on Data and Development. My question goes to almost everyone in this room. If reparations are the answer to Africa's debt problem, what steps would make them real and effective? I mean, we should start moving from diagnosing this problem and start looking for alternatives. What if reparations are not the ultimate solution? Then what?
Thank you so much. My name is Cristobal. I'm from Zimbabwe. I work with the Southern Africa Youth Forum. So I totally agree with all the discussions that are going on here. I feel like it's old wine that is being put in new bottles, because we are still talking about the same things, the issues of the carbon credits. You say that it's more like an incentive to say it's fine, you can pollute more. Here we're going to be creating the carbon sinks for you so that we capture the carbon. If we look at even the commitments that are being made, I remember at COP26 in Glasgow, Britain said that we are co-signing coal to history, but immediately at COP27, they signed a 50-year deal where they were still going to be extracting the same coal that they're saying that we should not be extracting here within the African countries. So really it's like a back and forth kind of scenario. And we as the Africans, we as the people within the global south, we actually get to bear the brunt of the climate crisis. If we look at the statistics that were shared by the World Vision, when the cyclone Idai happened, they talk about losing 733 million in buildings, in crops, in infrastructure, and over 100,000 homes were actually destroyed. So still we are the ones who are suffering, but we are actually the least contributors to this whole climate crisis. So my question is, how can reparation policies address intergenerational justice and historical trauma that is caused by both historical injustices and the ongoing climate crisis, particularly for African women and communities? Because when we look at the issues of when we look at this whole issue, you see that it's also inclined very closely with the mental health distress. So this is the question that I'm posing to any of the panelists. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good morning. My question is this. In the context of everything that is being discussed, we're talking about, feminist perspectives on debt and climate justice through reparations. And I do understand that is a timely conversation. I mean, great insights from all the panelists. But my question is this. I feel like we are in that period where there's a lot of conversations going on. There's a lot of discussions. There's a lot of engagements. Like, people are really more enlightened. But it's kind of ironic that it feels like there's a lot going on, but we're still going back in a way. Like, it feels like we're regressing in a sort of manner that is scary. When you look at, women's rights in this decade compared to the last decade, it feels like something that this is something that should have happened in the 60s, in the 40s, but we are seeing it in 2025. You speak of, people in many countries of Africa still don't have access to abortion. They have no sexual and reproductive health rights. You even see, from the so-called people that were, demanding for reparations from, you see the level of cruelty and inhumane activities that, acts that women are subjected to, and you also feel scary that, you know, if they can do that to their own people, you know, so it just feels like we're moving in cycle or anything. So is there something that you can speak to that? I mean, you look at, I think recently Namibia, you know, rejected that, you know, they don't want their women to be used as test subjects for, you know, a product, a contraceptive. So there is a lot that is going on globally. I mean, earlier this year we're talking about, you know, feminist funding, you know, being reduced, you know, aids have been cut. What we are using to do the research, to do this engagement, everything was just cut away. Even feminist organizations had to do some layoffs because they can no longer afford, you know, to do all of these things again because there is no funding. So what do you see to that? Like, and what can you say about that? And, you know, what's like the way forward? Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to speak in French, but I see that many of you didn't have your earphone. I will try to speak in English, but allow me to take more than 2 minutes because I need to translate what I need to say in French in English. It is another exercise, so it's not easy. So some of you ask what we can do. I think that we have today as feminists an opportunity in Africa level. We are looking, one of the panelists talk about rights. Another panelist talk about the condition linking to social protection, and she described what happened in Malawi. So I don't know if many of you are aware about protocol to the African Charter on human people's rights, on the rights of citizens, social protection and social security. I don't know if you are aware about these documents, but it is a key element to us as feminists, as Pan-African feminists, to master this document and to take it to make advocacy. Because in this document, they talk about what states need to do, what civil society need to do to cover the deficits of social protection, because it is now clear that it is social protection who will be the future of development of Africa, and our states need to invest in social protection. And how they can invest in social protection, it is to use the debt and illicit finance flow to finance our social protection. And it is possible. So in this protocol, they're already talking about climate change, the conflict and displacement. What is it for us? They're talking about women, informal workers, and they make provision in this protocol to reaffirm the rights for everyone to social protection. To affirm social protection must be part of the effort to mitigate climate change and build resilience. This protocol also develop an appropriate regulation and policy at national level and say how states can invest to women, youth, children, elders to achieve social protection. So if we can have this document as one of the pillars of our common advocacy today, and force or lobby our state to ratify this protocol, I think that all of women will have a legal instrument to talk about how debt can be used to develop Africa, how debt can be used to reduce inequality, social injustice against women. We have this task, and this protocol was adopted since 2022 by the government, because it is the government who requests AU and civil society to produce this document. And we do it, but since 5 years, 2002 and 3 years now, we just have only 2 countries in between the 54 countries of Africa who try to say yes, they want to ratify this protocol. They're not yet ratified. Only Zimbabwe make this effort to ratify. Please, go to this document, look at it, read it, this protocol in AU website, and you will see that the solution about all of the things that we are talking about is already inside. We are not going to reinvent the wheel, but the solution already existed. Let's take it like our way to advocacy and constrain our states to do it. So we are open to do it. I'm Dr. Ghislaine Saizono from ITUC Africa. Union members are ready to work with civil society to make this advocacy. Then we can develop advocacy arguments to use the debt and illicit finance fraud to finance social protection and to force our state to give us this protocol ratify, because they don't want to ratify the other ILO convention, but this is our own production in Africa. The willingness of the states to have this document. Why they don't want now to ratify? And women issues are inside. Okay. So please, climate issues are inside. Please read this document, take it, and we will see how to collaborate proper on the way to achieve that.
Thank you for that. I have just one last burning comment. Please use 1 minute.
1 minute. Thank you for the minute. I just want to concur with what the last speaker has just said. I'm also having the same idea, because I've been having a question that are we really supposed to look at this a feminist perspective on debt and climate justice only through reparations? Are we sure we are the rightful generation that's gonna benefit from the reparations, or we are doing it for our next generation? If it is our next generation, why can't you formulate something else which we'll be using at the moment to deal with this debt and climate justice? I thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all the comments and the questions. I'll quickly turn to the panelists. I'm sure they were each able to pick out key questions and comments that they would want to respond to. I'll give them 3 minutes each to respond and share their parting shots.
Thank you, moderator, and to the comrades that gave such wonderful interventions. I'll sum it up as this. We need to reform the global governance architecture and the global or the international financial institutions. And this is why. When you look at 2023, again, I'll go to the figures because I want to create an argument here. In 2023, Africa's total debt stock was $1.8 trillion. Just 2% of the global public debt stock. Germany alone in that same year had $2.9 trillion public debt, more than Africa. But the IMF classified in that same year 8 out of 9 African countries to be in debt stress. 8 out of 9 in that year of countries in debt stress were African. This is not by mistake. This is by design. Why? Because Africa is locked into 2 destructive systems. One, that Africa borrows in foreign currency. In that same year, 98% of the total debt stock owed by US, Europe, Germany, and all that was in their own respective currencies. It is only Africa which borrows in the US dollars and all that. The other aspect is that Africa's non-gold bank reserves, central bank reserves, are held in the United States dollars, in the euros, in pound sterlings. We don't have, let's say, cedis being used as bank reserves. So what do? I will leave you with a comment from Waiting for the Barbarians by Goetz. And he says, The new men of the empire are the ones who believe in fresh starts, new chapters, and new papers. I struggle with one old story, hoping that before it is finished, it will reveal to me why it was that I thought this was worth the trouble. Unless we talk about reforming the global financial architecture and the institutions which perpetrate, again, misogynistic, patriarchal connotations of the global governance systems, we will not be able to achieve this. And we have the opportunity through, one, post-CV, building to ensure that the outstanding issues are addressed, and most importantly, the already agreed upon Global Pact for the Future, it's a commitment, and also the SDGs. These provide pathways that we can explore as civil society through our governments to ensure that we have a system that works not only for the environment, but also for feminist justice. I thank you.
Yeah, I can also just add, and also to support the same on calling for reform of a global financial system, but also looking at the continuous discussion around it is that it needs to kind of also fall into action of where we say we're actually building movements and not working in silos, but to encourage more of the discussion to also localize it. So even while we do talk about breaking down the structure and continuing to question, and I believe it's actually for us to shift the narrative, that we cannot continue to be sidelined. Even in COP, it's the same. Even in a number of discussions, even in climate, the finance model generally is still not going to work for us. So it's ideally to see how to bridge and have movements that can actually extract more of this information, but localize it in a way that can be able to benefit the locals. So when we talk about energy transition, like my sister was saying, the discussion is literally that we cannot do in a time where we need to industrialize, where we need to actually form jobs. We need to still find a way to find African solutions that are tailored for us, that we do not line up in acceptance of what is being proposed to us, but to actually say no, we actually have an opportunity to demand for a reform. But even in regards to those different assessments that are being done by the IMF and World Bank, to reject and say we want human rights and climate justice to be at the center, because without human rights, which is actually legal obligations, literally there is law to it. And more of that also looking at domesticating some of those laws, that we need to see that we have a discussion that really comes to enrich in regarding to having a more centered, human rights centered, and people at the center, but calling mainly for reform of the system itself. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you to the lady behind for sharing that we should have a look at the protocol. Intergenerational learning is very important because I didn't know about it. Now I know about it, so I will have a look at it. Just to respond to some of the questions. So with the one, is the UN space, is the UN still the space for advocacy? And what opportunities are they? I think it goes back to what the two have said, which is, yeah, it is still the space because we need to get through to them in order for certain changes to be made, right? We can't make the changes by ourselves. And that means making sure that we have a larger representation of Africa as a continent. It actually even starts at the AU. So we start from there and then we make our way up there. So I'm not gonna belabor also the global financial architecture shifts. And then you talked about, I wasn't there at the conference that you attended in Malawi. I was somewhere else. But what do we do to quantify the loss and damage to ask for reparations? Again, I would say it comes down to systems, having systems in place on how best we can quantify, right? Because we've done a lot of research on the economic impact of the debt and things like that, but we don't have now the tools. I don't know, maybe other countries do, but the tools to now do the research properly and to quantify so it goes again down to the systems in the specific countries on how best that can be done. That would be my best response at the moment on how we can quantify the loss and damage. If reparations are not the solution, then what? That's also a very good question. So as Action Aid, we have been looking into alternatives, or what we're now calling the other world, which is, she mentioned it, which is focusing on people rather than profits, because clearly the economic models that we're using now are not working. They are not working, they haven't been working, and again, there's also research by ActionAid. It sounds like I'm promoting our research, but there's research done by ActionAid, 50 Years of Failure, that we launched 2 years ago, that also illustrates how this is not working. And then we have research that we did, Imagining a Feminist Wellbeing Economy, that illustrates the alternatives to the current economic models that is obviously not working. So that would be it. And in that, we are basically saying more investments into the social protection. We're saying cancel the debts, or at least restructure the debt to enable us to pay it back. And if we're getting loans, then they should be concessional loans and not the loans that we're getting now, because again, they're obviously not working for us. So yeah, those are some of the things that we are advocating for, and progressive taxation as well. That's what we're looking at, because we have outdated tax treaties that we are party to. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who asked questions and contributed. One of the questions, same as everyone, is the one on whether the UN is the space, and also what alternatives are we proposing. And I do agree that the UN is not, I would say, a transformative space. For those who engaged in the FFD process or just read around it, you know that the US walked out before the severe compromise was adopted. And then also with the ongoing negotiations on the UNTC, we know that they're trying to talk about things like global minimum tax threshold, and the US is already protesting things like that. So I do get that criticism, but also it is a strategic space where African states, but also African feminists must engage in, whether just to disrupt this neo-colonial order. So I do still think that the UNTC is a good alternative, especially when you consider that one of the driving forces is that we know that illicit financial flows, we lose about 89 billion US dollars annually, and this is a very small figure because this was computed a while back, so we're even losing much more. And Africa has the potential to generate about 220 US billion dollars if we can begin to curb illicit financial flows. And like she said, we have very outdated tax treaties, and all those things are what enable wealthy countries to continue extracting unregulated, and we just keep on losing more and more money. So the UNTC is an alternative, and it can be a Pan-African alternative. If we ensure that it's transformative enough, because I know we're talking about what happens if we don't get the reparations. That's what we are trying to, with this convention as well, we are trying to make sure that the money stops leaving the continent and we can resource our own public and social services. So that's my point on that. Also, one of the things that again, she talked about fair taxation and also things like wealth taxation. We know that after, I think, COVID, the number of billionaires, I don't know if it tripled or whatever it is, but they were 34% richer after a crisis where millions of people were dying. So this is just something that we really, as African people and as African states, we need to be engaging in this convention to ensure that African perspectives are actually central to this discussion. Then also, my parting shots, just like Saive said, let's promote the work, just joking. But yeah, as this discussion was supposed to center around also two papers, which is the 10 Decolonial Principles. We also have the FEMNET paper on Pan-African Feminist Perspectives on Justice through Reparation. So as my parting shots, I'll just also highlight some of the recommendations that are made in that paper as well. So towards a transformative feminist reparations framework, so to address these gaps, we need to recognize collective and intergenerational harm. This means that reparations must be directed not only to individuals, but at communities and generations affected by historical violence, and then centering reproductive and bodily autonomy. We must recognize colonial and post-colonial control over Black women's bodies as a central harm, with reparative measures including free reproductive health care, legal reforms, and cultural recognition of indigenous birthing knowledge. And then also advancing land and economic justice. I think we talked a lot yesterday about how the question of land is also central to the reparations discourse. So we must demand the restoration of dispossessed land, cancel illegitimate debt, and reconfigure trade regimes to redistribute power and not just wealth. And then also supporting epistemic and cultural reparations. This means funding feminist historiography, reviving indigenous languages, and supporting community knowledge systems disrupted by colonization. Also institutionalize gender transformative legal reforms, amend the constitutional and customary laws to recognize care work, protect against gender-based violence, and guarantee feminist participation in policy making. And lastly, redefine satisfaction and non-repetition. So this means going beyond apologies to ensure that systemic change happens, education reform, and gender-just climate policy, and the decolonization of all institutions. Thank you, everyone.